Thank you. Like Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, you've been a consistent supporter of military intervention in the Middle East, from the Iraq War to the Libyan War to the Syrian civil war. Some on your side of the aisle, including the president-elect, have said, well, we were given bad intelligence. They misled us on the intelligence on Iraq. Now, that's a very specific reason. There's probably some truth to it, but I think it misses sort of the lesson of the Iraq War. Likewise, your justification for maybe coming to a new approach on the Libyan civil war is, well, maybe we overestimated the idea of having viable successors there. To me, it seems like we're still missing the point, because even after Libya, you guys went on to Syria wanting to do the same thing again, and you've argued, well, maybe we just didn't do enough. If we'd done more, we could have toppled Assad and we could have had real regime change in Syria. Well, you got it in Iraq, you got it in Libya, and it's a disaster. The lesson of these wars is that regime change doesn't work. People say, oh, we're going to get rid of the iron fist, and Thomas Jefferson's going to arise from the ashes. Well, that is a naive notion to believe that Thomas Jefferson or his like live in Libya or live in Iraq. Their tradition is so much different than ours. I mean, we've been fighting against centralized power in the English tradition for 1,000 years. The revolution in England was 350 years ago. Ours was 250 years ago. That tradition they don't have. They have a tribal existence. You trade one for another. But mostly what you've gotten through the policies you have advocated, and Joe Biden has advocated, and frankly, John Bolton has advocated, this idea of regime change has been a disaster for the Middle East. We complain, everybody around here is concerned, Iran, Iran, Iran. Well, why is Iran stronger? Who's their best friend in the region now? Iraq. We did that. We had a balance of power. It wasn't perfect, but we had somewhat of a balance of power in the Middle East, and you guys messed it up. You got rid of the one bad guy, and another bad guy got stronger. And so then you went to Libya and did the same thing. And they said, well, maybe Libya's a one-off. Well, maybe there's a rule here. Maybe there's something we can learn about regime change, and maybe we can learn that humility would be that maybe we shouldn't be choosing every government in the Middle East. I would argue that instead of always choosing the governments, maybe we should not reward the bad ones. You know what I mean? So, for example, with Saudi Arabia, I despise the regime. I'd probably still trade with them. I probably wouldn't cut them off completely. I wouldn't sell them any more arms. And after they killed Khashoggi, they shouldn't have got one bit of our armaments. But both sides advocate for this. On UAE, we tried to stop that because UAE has a terrible human rights record. Both sides support it. The problem around here is we have bipartisan consensus. The problem isn't lack of consensus. The problem is too much consensus. But the consensus is for regime change. Are any of the lessons you've learned from the failure of Iraq war, Libyan war, the chaos, the vacuum, and more terrorism that occurred and more lives that were lost, and then to go on to Syria? I don't get that there's been a lesson learned. Is there any kind of lesson learned on your part that regime change may not be the best thing for us in the Middle East?
Senator, I think we and I certainly have an absolute obligation to try to learn from everything we've done, advocated, to take into account the results, and to make that inform how we think about these problems going forward. And I've done a lot of hard thinking about some of the very situations you mentioned. I'm proud of the fact that I have spent all of my career during the times I've been in government, for the better part of 25 years, working to advance our diplomacy, to do everything we possibly can to make sure that diplomacy is the first answer, not the last answer, and that war and conflict is a last resort.
The next step was Syria. The next step was the Syrian civil war, which looks a lot like the Iraq war and the Libyan
war. In Syria, there were those who were advocating for a repeat of Iraq, which is to say a whole-scale intervention. That's something that I did not agree with. When we were looking at what to do in Afghanistan.
But here's the problem in Syria. There was a predictable result there. Had you gotten rid of Assad, who were the fiercest fighters over there? Al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda. The more radical you were, the better fighters you were. The program that you started with Hillary Clinton, the program to train the moderate rebels, we spent $250 million. We trained about 60. We sent 10 of them into battle, and they were captured in the first 10 minutes. It was a complete disaster. This whole idea that there were moderates over there that we were going to support, doctors and lawyers and stuff, there were, but I don't think they were out there fighting. The ones out there fighting were jihadists, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, and if they'd have taken over the country, Assad's a terrible person, but I'm not positive that these people would have been better. So, I mean, it's the same lesson. Our humility has to be, let's quit toppling regimes over there. Let's don't support the bad ones, but let's don't presume enough that if we topple them, that in the vacuum, Thomas Jefferson is going to arise, because it never seems to happen. With regard to advise and consent, and this is a little bit on Senator Barrasso's extension of his question on treaties, it really isn't so much a solicitous mood to say, well, we just can't pass these treaties, so we're going to make all these agreements and they're not coming to you. But I would argue even more importantly on war. You have argued when you've been part of administrations that, oh, yes, you know, we'd like Senator Kane's, a more narrow AUMF, but we don't really need it. Now, you're not alone. That sort of, I think, arrogant executive sort of attitude comes from both parties. Every president for the last 50 years. In fact, they all probably believe this. They believe they have absolute power. It's called this absolute Article II authority. And this runs on both sides. But it runs through the extremes on our side. The John Boltons on our side believe in this absolute Article II authority. The AUMF from 9/11 had nothing to do with people in Somalia. Do you think the AUMF from 9/11 authorizes you to continue the war in Somalia?
I think the AUMF from 9/11 has been used in countries and against groups that were not contemplated or cited in the AUMF, which is the very strong reason why we should revisit it.
But it's very specific. It says people who organized to attack us. It doesn't mention, you know, people say, well, they say and associated forces. That's not in it. That's somebody dreamed that up later and sort of said that it's in. It's not in there. It doesn't say associated forces. There is no authorization for war in Somalia, Mali, Yemen, which the Obama administration originally did support. So there really isn't. And I'm not for a more narrow one. I'm just for no more war over there. I'm tired of all the war. I'm tired of all the nation building. Look, I love the rights of women as much as anybody, but if our goal is going to be that we're going to keep women in power, like in Saudi Arabia, we're going to go to war with Saudi Arabia because they don't have women ministers of health and stuff. You know, it really isn't exactly our national security that you're talking about. You're talking about something different. Now, from the point of view of the Secretary of State, there are things you can do through soft power to advocate for the principles we believe in. But overthrowing governments to instill women's rights or to continue women's rights and to continue a military presence there and fight battles for it is really not something that is in the purview of the Secretary of State or really under the Constitution to anyone in our government. With regard to NATO, you've advocated for expanding NATO. Do you still support putting Georgia in NATO?
If a country like Georgia is able to meet the requirements of membership and if it can contribute to our collective security, yes, the door should remain open.
So if you're successful, then we would be at war with Russia now.
I actually think just the opposite. I think that, Senator, with regard to NATO membership, there's a very good reason that Russia has proved aggressive against countries that are not actually in NATO and under the umbrella, and a good reason why it's chosen not to attack.
This would be adding Georgia that's occupied to NATO under Article 5, then we would go to war.
Well, I think we've seen, again, in the past that countries that have joined NATO have not been the same target of Russian aggression that we've seen.
We were talking about 20 years ago, we might have a valid argument now. Russia occupies Georgia. Russia occupies, or proxy troops occupy part of Ukraine. So I think adding either of them to NATO not only is provocative, but you'd have to think what comes next. I mean, if we're obligated to defend our NATO allies, I mean, basically we'd be voting for war. So I wouldn't vote to add Georgia to NATO, not on your life, unless I'm ready to send my kids and your kids to go fight in Georgia. You know, the complicated fights and wars and occupation around, and I just think that we need to think these things through. And I think for every provocation, there's a response as well. So we can't look at it in a vacuum. People say, I don't care what Russia thinks, or I don't care what Tehran thinks. Well, if we don't understand our adversaries enough to think how they will respond, then I don't think we're doing our job.
I agree with you.
But as you can tell, I'm not excited about more military intervention in the Middle East. I think there has been some chastening on the part of the incoming administration over previous failures. But I don't think you have completely gotten the idea that regime change has been a terrible disaster. It's created vacuums, chaos, and actually more terrorism throughout the region. So I hope you will consider that. It's important, not just for the philosophic point, but it's important for our kids. I mean, we're sending these kids over to fight in these wars that go on forever and ever and ever, and somebody's got to stand up and I hope you will be somebody brave enough to stand up and stop some of this.
I appreciate what you said.
The $64 million, though, is the tip of the iceberg. There's still about $10 billion out there that was designated for the Afghan government. Can you pledge today, without equivocation, that the Biden administration will not release any of this money to the Taliban?
Absent the Taliban making good on the commitments and expectations of the international community that I've outlined previously, that's correct.
Maybe we could deduct a fee for the weapons they took.
So, Senator, on the weapons, again, I'll defer to my colleagues at the Pentagon who are more expert in this. You're right that about $80 billion worth of weaponry has been provided over the course of the last 15 or 16 years. Much of that, the significant weaponry, planes, helicopters, is actually inoperable, will soon become inoperable because it can't be maintained. In terms of the strategic threat that weaponry poses, it doesn't to us or to Afghanistan's neighbors.
But you can't say you're not going to give them the money. If they behave, you're going to give them the money. Why don't we subtract the $80 billion from the $10 billion you're going to give them? Then they're minus 70 still. I mean, really, the fact that you're entertaining good behavior, that they'll get more money, I think is a big mistake and a naive notion that we're going to somehow change this Stone Age philosophy by giving them more of our money. We've sunk trillions of dollars over this. This is our chance to have a peace dividend. Let's quit sending good money after bad.